Welcome to Issues in Rural Crime and Society, our vodcast at the Center for Rural Criminology, here with my co-host and co-director, Dr. Alistair Harkness. And today we're lucky to have a Ph.D. student from West Virginia University, Danielle Stoneberg. Do you want to start off, Danielle, by just kind of letting us know a little bit about yourself generally, kind of a bit of insight into your research, and then we can just take it from there?
Yeah, so hello. Thank you guys so much for inviting me here today. My name is Danielle Stoneberg, and I'm currently going to be a fourth-year PhD student in the sociology program at West Virginia University. I came here in 2018, but prior to that, I was at the University of Central Oklahoma, where I received my bachelor's in psychology and my master's in crime and intelligence analysis. And while I was there, I worked with Dr. Rashi Shukla on methamphetamine research. And that's kind of how I became involved with criminology and specifically rural criminology. And then from attending conferences, that's how I started to link up with Dr. Donnermeyer and Dr. DeCesaretti and Dr. Nolan. And then the latter two invited me to apply to West Virginia University for a PhD program. And so that's how I'm here now. A lot of my research while I've been with them at West Virginia University has been centered around violence against women, but my thesis and dissertation is going to be still focused on drugs in rural places.
Right on.
Do you
Thanks
want
so
me to
much for
say
that.
anything more?
No. Oh, there we go. We got another guest. That's okay. The more the merrier. We're gonna hear my dogs barking in the background, probably several times, and possibly a baby crying. So it's okay. Adds to the authenticity of our conversation. Yeah. So can you just tell us a little bit generally about the research that you plan to undertake? Maybe some of the key themes, but especially how that overlaps with rural criminology and the rural more generally.
Yeah, so for my thesis, I am actually using data that Dr. Shukla had collected when she was collecting data to write her book, Methamphetamine, A Love Story. And so when I was her research assistant, I was specifically reading the parts of the interviews only focused on desistance. And so for an entire year, I was really immersed in that data and ended up, summarizing it for her, writing up a couple different things, and she ultimately ended up using parts of it for her book. But when I was reading these parts of the interviews, and then later, whenever we would go on rural law enforcement visits and go to these different rural communities, I was really interested to learn how, resources available to them, they might have to drive hours to go and go to a treatment center, but almost all of these communities have a jail or have a prison nearby. And so it was like, we go ahead and we have things to go ahead and punish them, but we don't really have things to on the ground to go ahead and help them actually become productive members of society, or even help them become sober, or really just help them function. And that's not to say, I mean, obviously those of us who do rural research, like, we know that that's not limited to just drug users. We know that resources in general are very difficult. And so for my thesis, I'm focusing on those interviews again, but looking for redemption narratives and kind of how the individuals believed that they were redeemable and what that really meant to them. Even though Dr. Shukla really didn't ask about redemption narratives, I've seen it come out in their interviews. And then for my thesis,
Can you
because
say
I
what you
am in
mean a
West.
little bit by redemption and that concept, and what a redemption narrative might mean?
Yeah, and so a redemption narrative, I mean, especially in qualitative research, can kind of mean a lot of things, but especially in the narratives that I'm reading, I'm really seeing it in the sense of, someone being like, I have a partner who believes that I can become sober. And so, they're making sure that I get to all of my AA meetings, or, I have kids and I know that I'm going to have to go to treatment or be incarcerated, but instead of my children going to state custody or the foster care system, as it's called here in America, like my family will go ahead and take the children while I'm incarcerated or while I'm away. So then I don't have to worry about then having to also fight the state to get them back. So those are types of things that could be a redemption narrative.
And are they formalized, Danielle, are they formalized processes? So somebody is an individual taking it upon themselves to put in place arrangements to say, look after the kids while they're in custody?
So I think it could be both. In the instances, I mean, I don't have the whole interviews, and also like Dr. Shukla didn't ask about, necessarily those things. But I do think that, it could be a mix of the two, depending on what the circumstances were.
Yeah. But you're picking up on one of those points that you made around access to justice and the gross disparity between services and opportunities which would be located in inner city places or urbanized environments and those in the country. And it's even just things like accessing to, and we'll probably get on to policing because I've got a few questions for you about policing and the different contexts in America there. But even just accessing police, being required by the court perhaps to go and present at the police, but then there's a long journey ahead and there's access to car and finances to fill it with petrol and so on and so forth.
I think what's really interesting about all this too is that at least in the Canadian context, in certain American states, increasingly in the Australian context, I guess in predominantly Western countries, you're seeing that shift, at least hopefully, for the first time in a long time, away from a bit of police-like mentality towards drugs to a public health strategy, and one that treats drug issues as a public health issue as opposed to as a criminal justice issue. Not all the way there, of course, still a lot to do, but I think that's really emphasized the inequality and differences between the urban and the rural. So as you see these types of opportunities pop up in urban spaces, safe injection sites and things like that, their absence is kind of more starkly defined than in rural spaces where there isn't access to this. And you brought up a good point there, Alistair, just in terms of distance. Like we went to a program through Fair Treatment here in Australia called The Long Walk to Treatment. And they had interviews on a variety of individuals that were seeking treatment for drug use. And one of them was from a rural space. And she spoke about how, when she had instances of relapse or when she, needed those levels of support, they weren't there. They were not immediate. They weren't even, within a hour or two. They were literally within an 8-hour drive into the inner city from where she was. And public transportation was nil, and this person couldn't afford a vehicle. And so really they were just stuck on their own. Do you know what I mean? And so that narrative of kind of going into the city for treatment, coming back out very far away into your own environment again, and then just being kind of left on your own was really, really interesting and emphasize those clear differences between the rural and the urban.
Yeah, and so this might be skipping ahead just a little bit, but
all around.
Well, in my elevator talk that I had given at the last meeting, I talked about State Question 780 and 781 that have been implemented in Oklahoma. And the 781 part was the part of it that was supposed to take those monies that they had saved, from going ahead and doing this. And it was actually supposed to be like fueling them back into treatment centers locally in all of the counties. But I've since been told, so whenever we were doing our interviews, we actually did a portion of them before the legislation got voted on. We did a portion as it got voted yes. And then we actually did a portion after the fact of interviews. And so in all of us doing interviews, we didn't actually see the money getting pushed back yet because it was too early. It was, not even a year after it had been implemented. Yeah. But I've been told since then, since it has been a couple of years since 780 and 781 have been implemented, that we're not seeing that promise of monies back into the communities like we were sold whenever we voted, yes on the legislation. And so that's a huge issue, especially whenever, we're talking about rural communities were promised that this money SAID was going to go back into their treatment centers, and now they've received little, if any, money to go ahead and revamp their treatment centers.
Yeah, just as reinvestment's only going to work if there's the reinvestment part of it, because then the justice doesn't get delivered, does it?
Yeah,
what
I mean,
about,
I know.
Sorry, go ahead.
This is like off the topics of drugs, but another example of like services. When I was a victim advocate at the hospital and I responded to sexual assault exams, I mean, I can remember one occasion when I had a rural law enforcement officer drive a victim in his car 2 hours just to go ahead and get a sexual assault exam. He stayed in his car, you know, the whole time while we did the exam, and then ended up driving her back, you know, back the 2 hours home, and was taking her straight to go get a VPO. And so it's like, that was probably like a very rare occasion for a rural law enforcement officer to drive a victim 2 hours. Like, how many times does a victim probably not get drove from a rural a rural place into an urban place just to get a sexual assault exam because they don't have a place nearby to receive one?
Yeah.
There's some examples of even more remote places in Australia where it's not driving them, but flying them because
same in Canada.
It's a full day. I just wonder whether you'd just be able to paint a quick picture of the study area there in Oklahoma. What are some of the sort of the features of that rural space for people who might not be familiar with that area?
Yeah, so I would say from living and also doing rural law enforcement visits in Oklahoma is a lot of Oklahoma is flat land. There are some major cities and more so like urban areas, but then, you know, I'm not sure if anyone's really familiar with the geography of Oklahoma, or at least, you know, like seeing it on a map, it kind of has a panhandle. And then like the rest of it is, you know, kind of square. And I mean, in the panhandle part, you can drive for hours in the panhandle and rarely even find a gas station. You know, the kind of ongoing joke is that you see more gravestones in the panhandle than you do see people in the panhandle. And so a lot of it, like I said, is flat land. I know in the southern part of the state, that's kind of where you're going to see more wooded areas. And when we went to our rural law enforcement visits, that's actually where they started talking about like timber related thefts and like thefts related to forestry. We do have agriculture, so, you know, that is also rural related crimes associated with that as well.
And just in terms of drugs, are there particular types of drugs that are more prominently used in those rural parts of Oklahoma?
Yeah, so meth is still a really big issue in Oklahoma. Also, prescription pills are an issue. Yeah, our rural law enforcement, whenever they would talk about prescription pills, they said that it was always difficult to get people to, you know, report on them because they kind of have this mentality of, well, they're being prescribed, so it's not really, you know, it's not really illegal or necessarily like a drug that people, you know, can't use. But the fact of the matter is unless it was prescribed to you, like.
And there's that overlap there between medical use and recreational use. You know, when people start taking the drug for a medical purpose, and then it becomes more of a kind of, I guess recreational is not always the correct word when it turns into a habit forming and problematic issue, but there's that overlap there. And so that helps kind of psychologically neutralize the use as well. And why would I report on this? And
Yeah, they did talk about, I mean, of course, there's still going to be, you know, influxes sometimes of, you know, heroin or cocaine or different things like that. But methamphetamine is still one of the predominant drugs that they're having to combat in Oklahoma right now.
Yeah, wow.
Just when you mentioned the forested parts of Oklahoma, it brings to mind a memory from quite a number of years ago. I must have been back in 2009, and I travelled with a committee over to New Zealand, and we're looking at ways of sun smart, healthy eating in primary schools and secondary schools. And we visited a little place in New Zealand, about 40 or 50 kilometres drive out of Rotorua, and heavy pine plantation area. And one of the things we did was walk around the school and have a look at the facilities, and then go and speak to people at the school. Said, have you considered putting in shade sails, a bit of sun smart protection? Said every time we put up the shade sails, and they're pretty expensive, they disappear. And they wondered where they were going. They're all ending up in the pine forest because crooks are growing cannabis and using it to avoid detection from the air and protect the actual crops as well. So every time they'd put up these very expensive shade sails to keep the kids from getting burnt, they'd disappear out into the forest.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because the southern part of the state where we had whenever we had went down there, of course, like meth is still an issue there. But I guess back before, at least I lived in the state of Oklahoma, apparently it used to be really big for marijuana like distribution, and apparently it was so big that it was like known outside of the US. Like law enforcement there was telling us about how, like they might travel outside of the United States, say like go on a family vacation to Mexico, and they would see people with like merchandise, like selling like hats or t-shirts that would like, I forget the name of it now. If I can like think of it, I'll tell you guys afterwards. But yeah, like whatever this like name was that they had for the town, like people were selling merchandise, like advertising this like marijuana that was like grown in southern Oklahoma. So yeah, it was apparently a really big deal.
And just in terms of the meth, is it are they big sort of meth labs, or is it sort of caravan Breaking Bad style small operations? What's the sort of the meth industry, if for want of a better term, like there?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. Prior to 2005, when pseudoephedrine and ephedrine, which people predominantly probably know those two drugs associated with cold or cough medicine. But prior to 2005, you could go ahead and buy them over the counter, not need to give your driver's license or different things like that. But because people were using them a lot to produce methamphetamine and use them as precursor chemicals in the lab setups that you're talking about, they went ahead and enacted a law nationally that said, no, we have to go ahead and put pseudoephedrine and ephedrine behind the counter. And so whenever pseudoephedrine and ephedrine was put behind the counter in 2005, probably like 2006-ish, that's whenever we start to see the Mexican drug cartels start to fill this void that was left by US local manufacture. And so there are still very small labs across the United States and other countries, because it wasn't just the United States that enacted this kind of legislation. But right now, primarily, the meth that is being seized in the United States is coming from Mexican drug cartels and is being manufactured in like very large labs and lab setups in Mexico, and then being imported into the country, the United States.
That's what happens when you put Walter White out of business. Can we move back to talking a little bit about those redemption stories? Because a few things you said struck me, and I think it'll allow us to talk a little bit more about the specifics of the rural environment. So what does that look like in a rural kind of socio-cultural context, a redemption story, and how does that play into kind of social norms and values and morals and things like that in a rural space, which, as we know, Joe would chastise me for setting up binaries here, but which have definitive features that are based very much on the local environment, but you can make some general assumptions, for instance, based on ideological difference in voting patterns. So what does that look like in terms of these redemption stories?
Yeah, so I think even to kind of connect this to the rural law enforcement interviews that I went on, although, the officers weren't necessarily saying like, I see a redemption narrative in this person, but I think that when service providers, whether it be law enforcement or even community members, so like if community members believe in a redemption narrative, about individuals, like believe that they have redeeming qualities, that they are not, that they are more than just being, say, a drug addict or a convicted felon or whatever the case is, then they may go ahead and vote on, or they probably will be more likely to go ahead and vote on legislation, say, for treatment options, for services, welcome those sorts of things into their communities, instead of only having a punitive idea and believing that like these people aren't more than just their conviction, or they aren't more than just being, you know, a hillbilly drug addict who isn't going to amount to anything. And I think the officers that we spoke to would kind of, even because a lot of the times they lived in the communities that they were policing. And so, you know, we had one officer that talked about like, whenever he ultimately had to leave the community that he was policing, because it got to the point that he had already like policed all of the people in the community, and he was like starting to even arrest family members, and he was just like, I couldn't do it anymore. Like that was like heartbreaking for me. And so these officers would kind of talk about like, yes, understanding that their job was to go ahead and, you know, make arrests and different things like that, but that didn't necessarily make it the easiest job. And so, you know, if there was leeway to go ahead and work with those individuals of being like, look, I'm not going to arrest you this time, instead go ahead and get treatment or try to do this as an alternative, then they would. But when it would, you know, kind of push over that threshold of like, I can't look away anymore, and like we need to take action because you're a harm not only to yourself but also to the community at large, then they would obviously go ahead and do their job. So yeah, I think with my dissertation, that's something that I really want to go ahead and examine more and see, especially in rural places, how can we, you know, work on bettering that.
Yeah, and implementing some of those diversion schemes, you know, recognising that, particularly if that legislation is not being implemented in the spirit in which it was voted upon, then it becomes incumbent on those individual police officers or law enforcement officers to exercise their discretion and try to do something for the good of their own community, injecting a little bit of their own moral judgment, I guess.
Yeah, and even, I mean, the officers that we spoke to, especially before necessarily 780 and 781 were passed, they expressed, it's not that we don't want this legislation to be passed, but the legislation was actually wrote with no amounts listed. And so it was kind of like a blanket, like, we're going to go ahead and decriminalize drugs, or, you know, take these felonies down to misdemeanors, but it didn't have amounts listed. And so it wasn't until it was passed that they go ahead and say, okay, now we're saying 18 grams of methamphetamine or 19 grams of methamphetamine you can carry. And the officers were like, whoa, like that's way past personal use. Like that's trafficking. Like, why? Like that's what we have an issue with, is really the amount, not the philosophy of going ahead and, you know, taking down some of these, you know, amounts from felony to misdemeanors and reinvesting resources into the community. Like, we would like that. That would make our job easier, especially in rural law enforcement. You know, they were like, I'm everything. I'm the person who responds to take nuisance dogs away and also be therapists and also be, you know, mental health providers. And like, that would actually help make my job easier. But at the same time, it's like that amount that I'm really having an issue with.
Yeah. And then overarching above all of that is the fact that there's a pipeline of supply coming in from the cartels in Mexico. So, you know, locking up some low-level dealers with whether it's 15 or 17 or 20 grams, it's all redundant because somebody else will just fill that place immediately, even if they're, I presume, even if they're being brought in from interstate, in order to keep this manage the demand.
Yeah, and I think that one thing that the law enforcement officers, and I think that it was really because of where, so I talked about in the elevator talk that Oklahoma is kind of situated in the United States, kind of like right in the middle. And so we have two of the major highways that go, you know, north and south from Mexico to Canada. And then we also have the highway that goes, you know, west and east. We're kind of at that nice sort of intersection. And so, especially where we're located, we're seeing violence related to the drug industry and the drug crime that is in our communities. And so that's a lot different than if we were just, you know, picking up small amounts of drugs and it really wasn't necessarily hurting anyone. But now we have this association of cartel violence with it. Like, I mean, by no means is it, you know, the cartel violence level of what Mexico is currently seeing, but there is an associated violence with that.
Yeah. And it's not by accident that the drug business is concentrated in certain places like that intersection. I know there's examples in my state of Victoria where there's one town in particular where the highways intersect between Victoria, New South Wales and South Australia, and outlaw motorcycle gangs are preeminent there. And it's because it's a business model. You know, they've got the logistics and they know that they can get things from one part of the country to another. Yeah, it really is big business.
Yeah, and even the I mean, even communities that we would go through, like we also saw the prevalence of you know, organized motorcycle gangs, if you know, however you want to go ahead and refer to them as. We also saw their prevalence in this community. So it's like we have motorcycle gangs, we also have, you know, Crips and Bloods, and then we also have Mexican, you know, drug cartels in these communities. Like, yes, they're not super, you know, prevalent maybe as you would have in an urban area, but for a small town, that can have a huge impact. One of the cities that we had went to that I was familiar with before we did our studies, they talked about how a drug deal had gone bad and it resulted in the rival gang bringing machine guns to the town and just shooting up the gang members' mother's house. Like, I mean, to law enforcement, you know, it was unprovoked because they didn't have any knowledge of this drug deal gone bad, but now they're having to deal with, you know, drive-by shootings in a small town of less than 50,000 people.
Yeah. So that is all that we've just talked about for the past few minutes, I think makes your point very well. That example you gave of that police officer that is probably quite liberal on drugs and drug use and how to treat drugs. But when it crosses that threshold into what they perceive as trafficking, then it kind of challenges those beliefs because they see the kind of on costs and damages there. And so at what point is that shift made? So yeah, it's really interesting, and then compounded with the kind of characteristics of rural spaces.
Yeah, and I mean, we even had, you know, I was listening to your interview with Jessica Peterson, and it was really interesting to hear her talk about how, like, once you built this rapport with them, how they would even go ahead and give you more information. I think Dr. Shukla, myself, and our research team was completely comprised of women. And I honestly think that helped us get more information from them than what they would have given like male researchers. I mean, we had officers feeling comfortable enough to tell us about how like their ex-wives were currently struggling with addiction, and that made them have compassion for the drug users in their community. Or, you know, a rural officer had talked about how his brother was an addict, and I think he had passed away. And so, you know, it's those sorts of things, especially in rural communities, where I feel like everyone that I know from Oklahoma is touched in some way or knows of someone who has been impacted by drug use or drug abuse. And that really, that's hard to kind of separate, of being like, well, I don't care about this issue, when everyone that you know, or seemingly a lot of people that you know, is being hurt and harmed by it.
Yeah, one of the an interesting thing is again the root source of the drugs that are coming into communities like those rural communities in Oklahoma coming in from Mexico. And I know you saw the video, the half an hour clip, and we might share this on the podcast so others can see it. But it was from the ABC, Australian ABC's foreign correspondent program, and we're looking at one particular drug cartel. And what I thought was particularly interesting was the interview with the observations of a 13-year-old boy when he was asked what did he feel about all the killing. He said, well, if there were no drugs, there would be no killing, would there? And then they pan across to an older person, perhaps his father or a relative, and when asked, why do you involve the 13-year-olds? Because the younger they are, the more they learn. It's a really a sort of sad thing, and it just shows that it's intergenerational, and there is, and we might get onto corruption in the United States, but certainly the corruption there in Mexico.
Yeah, and it was really interesting because even in the visits that we would go to, like they would talk about like intergenerational in terms of like, I've arrested the grandfather, the father, and now I'm picking up the kids and possibly even the grandkids. Like I've arrested all of them. Like I know this family very well. Like they all, reside in my community. Some of them are still currently incarcerated. And then you also see that as well of like, they weren't necessarily using, but they could have been trafficking, or they could have been selling or manufacturing. So yeah, you definitely see that intergenerational impact as well in the rural areas.
So very much a learned behavior, and passed down through generations. It becomes almost a way of life, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and just going back to what you're speaking about with the police officer perceptions and stuff, I think it really emphasizes as well the difference between which all of us have, I guess, in our respective work environments, but especially police, the difference between a bit of a personal opinion and a personal ideology and a personal perception and personal experiences versus the conflicts that can kind of come between the two. I've seen it here kind of over and over again on Q&A, Alistair, which is a popular kind of, I don't know what you call it, talk show in Australia, where when the police are on talking about drugs or something like that, they just really repeat the kind of corporate line. And you can tell you're not speaking to an individual, because I guess you can't speak to an individual at that point. You're speaking with a representative of a particular police group. So yeah, it's really interesting you bring how those tensions come to the fore, but then they're even more accentuated in a rural space where people know each other a little bit better and have those more, I guess, familial and friendly relationships.
Yeah, I mean, it was really funny because when 780 and 781 were being voted on and even leading up to the votes, and we were going to these agencies, we would talk about, the only advertisement that we've seen on TV or campaigns that we've seen on TV has been supporting 780. Like, if this is how police feel, like, why aren't we seeing anything? Yeah. And they actually told us that like the police union would not go ahead and put out a campaign. And so one of the officers, I think he was a sheriff, he had said, I had wanted to go ahead and put out campaigns, but I was told that I would have to do it out of like my own personal funds and kind of do it that way. Yeah. And again, are you willing to do that if what I've been told that many of the rural areas actually voted no for the legislation, and that it was those bigger urban areas like Oklahoma City and Tulsa that actually carried the yes votes and that ultimately ended up getting it voted. And so they were like, if I know that my community is going to say no, but ultimately it's going to get passed, like, why would I want to go ahead and spend all this money?
Yeah, and you need the support of your community as well when you're policing. Yeah. That's really interesting. Just something that struck me when you did start to talk about those redemption stories a little bit as well, is a lot of this overlaps, which you may be interested for your own research, with the literature on punitiveness and people's perceptions on punishment and basically what to do with people who break the law. And a lot of that has to do with their perceptions of redemption, i.e. whether or not they judge that the person has the capacity to be redeemed. If so, if that kind of moral judgment is made, i.e. they committed the crime because of this sociological factor, not they committed the crime because they're a terrible, bad person. That very much shapes their capacity to, or willingness to, I guess, characterize the person with an ability to to redeem themselves. And then therefore that influences their decision on whether, they should go to prison for a very long time, or if we should focus rehabilitative resources on them. So it's really interesting that overlap there generally with the more specific example of drug use. If people see a capacity, if they see the individual and the actions of the individual as, I guess, more broader than just good or bad, shades of gray, it very much shapes their responses to these types of issues.
Yeah, and I think that kind of also made me more interested in pursuing this as a dissertation topic, given, that we are seeing pushes for, marijuana to be, recreational and now medicinal in states, and also, people being released from prisons in, great numbers, who may be low-level drug offenders. And I think that that's great. But then again, like, how great is that if you're taking them back to communities that still don't go ahead and have resources for them, or for them to go ahead and access. And so I know here in West Virginia, we created some harm reduction strategies. So, like syringe, people could go ahead and do needle exchanges. And I think it was going on for a couple months, and then all of a sudden, like, it got shut down, and they were like, no, like, you can't go ahead and like exchange your needles anymore. And so it's just like, well, so do you believe that people are redeemable, or do you not believe that people are redeemable? Because, when you do go ahead and say that we're going to do these harm reduction strategies, but then you're wanting to take away those things, like, that's going in opposition of what you're saying.
Yeah, I know in my local area a number of years ago, again, there was and still is a needle exchange. In fact, it was so successful they were gathering more needles, more syringes each year than they're actually they were giving out.
Wow.
But there was always a groundswell, and particularly around local government election time, from candidates who would say, "Oh, we've got to get rid of them. We don't want the riffraff in the streets." But then it should be put out in some industrial area.
Yeah, NIMBY.
And neglecting to think, well, how are the people actually going to get there? And then they'll turn around and complain, "Oh, well, there's needles on the street. I almost stepped on one." So you've got to do something about it, but nothing that's going to have an impact on me and my belief system. And it just becomes problematic for decision makers too, sort of juggling that mixture of views and trying to convince people of the evidence as well.
Yeah, It's been interesting in Canada. I mean, I'm no extreme expert, but I've found it very interesting, the development of safe injecting sites specifically. I forget when it was, sometime between 2012 and 2015, when the Harper government was in. They tried to shut down Insight, which was the first, I think, safe injection site in Vancouver, and very successful. It had a bunch of research behind it, showed a bunch of very, very positive outcomes in terms of crime reduction, safety, deaths, all these types of things. The government tried to shut it down. The Supreme Court ruled against them, and it was very successful. And that was a bit of a watershed moment. So what you saw actually was, I guess what you'd call doing good by stealth. So you saw a lot of these public health initiatives pop up in a local area, but it wasn't publicized and it wasn't talked about. It just happened overnight. And so it was almost overnight. You had all these safe injection sites because they kind of had the example and the legal authority, which was pretty gray before it, to now do it. And so you didn't have to combat that political element, which, of course, politicians are very afraid of touching that not in my backyard syndrome and those issues that come. And they're just there. Obviously, it came with some conflict and issues, but the way in which they, I guess, kind of went around the democratic process, for lack of a better word, which in these moral, fear-based issues that bring into account issues of, that people really care about in urban areas, like the prices of their homes and things like that, it's moving around those political conversations, not having to happen.
I think it's going to be really interesting. I've heard of a couple different initiatives. I haven't read into them to see if they're still surviving post-pandemic, but I know in one of the communities that I had read an article about how their local, one of the local organizations was actually saying we understand that you may not be able to come to us, and so we're going to come to you. And so they actually had vans and different transportation that if you called them up and you were I'm on the corner of First Street and, whatever, then they would go ahead and come to you and, like, is it that we can give you, do you need needles? Like, do you need Tylenol? Like, what is it that we can go ahead and help you? And they would actually go ahead and try to do those initiatives. And so I thought that that was incredible because I've never heard of that before. Yeah. But like also, especially whenever you are in rural areas where you know that people are going to have issues with transportation, people are going to have issues with internet access, people are going to have issues with public transportation, like those are things that you have to consider, especially if you want the overdose deaths in your county to go down, or you want the drug related crime in your city to go down. Like these are things that you have to consider. Of you can go ahead and put legislation in, but if you're also not following that up actively with things like this, then how well is that actually going to do to accomplish what goals you had set out with that legislation?
Yeah, if the same old's not working, then why would you keep on doing the same thing? It's the first sign of madness, isn't it? Keep repeating your mistakes. Just when you're telling me about the deliveries, it's like Uber Health, isn't it? Uber Community Care. Now, when you did the elevator presentation, and for those listening and watching, this was coordinated by the International Society for the Study of Rural Crime, ISROC or ISSRC, and Danielle did a presentation there. And one of the things that you mentioned was some of the sort of levels of corruption within some of the law enforcement. I wonder whether you could just illustrate that with an example or two.
Yeah, so in my presentation, I had talked about how one of the things that I don't think any of us on the research team assumed that we would stumble upon was corruption. In our minds, we were like, they're just going to tell us that meth is probably their main issue and move on. Or, like drug related crimes were, kind of the crime that they were dealing with. But in one instance, we came to, I'm laughing because like remembering this now, it's just like, I don't think that 3 women who like literally drove like 2.5 hours, we're in the middle of nowhere. I don't even know if we actually had cell service, and we get there and the chief takes us into a room and the mayor is also there, and we're just like, okay, this is kind of very bizarre. Like, what are we doing? Like, we only thought that we were going to talk to the chief, but it also wasn't uncommon for us to show up to interviews and then be like, oh, and like also talk to so-and-so and here's so-and-so and like do extended interviews. But we ended up talking, I think it was for like an hour and a half with the chief and the mayor before we even then sat down to have a whole different conversation with the chief. And one of the things that they were talking about was in this small agency, they both had not been born and raised in that town. So they had kind of came to it in the last couple years. And what they had discovered was that a lot of the city council members were involved in the local drug trade of some sense. And so whenever they would go ahead and say, arrest John Smith, who maybe had been a family member or a friend of a person on the council, they would take them to the sheriff's office, which was just down the road, maybe 10, 15 miles. And by the time that they drove back to town, the 10 or 15 miles, that person would already be bailed out of the sheriff's office or of the jail. And so they really felt that they were like struggling to do anything in their community to combat crime, to combat drugs, to just even do their jobs, because anywhere that they looked, they were going ahead and like facing some sort of hostility. One of my favorite lines from them in the interview process was that they wake up every morning and they put their machine gun on their back because they don't know like what they're going to be facing from their community members. Like they legitimately expressed their life being in danger, and that they were like trying to reach out to law enforcement agencies above them at the state and the federal level to get help, because they were like scared of the intimidation process that they were facing in their local community. So yeah, that was like one instance where we just like, we're not prepared for that. Like, we left the interview and we were just like whispering back to the car, and we were like, we're not going to say anything until like we get to the next town. And we legitimately didn't say anything like in the car to one another, because like we were just like, we're so creeped out by like what we just heard. Like the mayor and the chief actually like were living in RVs like next to one another in like kind of like a plot of land, because they didn't know what was going to happen to them. And I can tell you that I still kept in contact with the chief, and I know that he's no longer like at that jurisdiction. So yeah, it was really crazy.
It must make it incredibly difficult for recruitment and retention of police officers in those communities. If you think that you have to live, you have to live with the machine gun in close proximity to the police station because you're fearful.
Yeah, he was saying that they would actually fly drones. Like they had drones that would follow both him and the mayor, and also their like wives and children around. So they were just like, we don't know like what is going to happen to us.
Yeah, we speak a lot about outsiders when it comes to offenders in rural communities, but this is really interesting insight into law enforcement as outsiders who don't come from the particular area, might not know the cultural geography, might not, be seen as included insiders despite their role as law enforcement, but actually are actively challenged and set out against, based on their status as outsider and based on not kind of going along with the socially organized norms that perhaps are conducive to criminal offending and criminal behavior.
Yeah, and another example of corruption that we again kind of stumbled upon was we went to this community, and the officer took us around in his squad car, and he had took us to this like abandoned strip club. I don't know like how else to describe that, or if there's like another term for a strip club, but he had taken us to the strip club that was no longer operational. And he had said, when it had been in operational years before, what had actually happened is him and his jurisdiction were trying to stop activity, like criminal activity that was going on in like the shed that was attached to the strip club, or kind of like another space of the strip club. And what ended up happening was the owners of the strip club actually had friends in the neighboring jurisdiction. And so they would go ahead and try to have those friends like notify them if like there was going to be a raid or something like that. And once law enforcement found it out, then they were like, okay, well, now we have to go ahead and kind of find ways to have raids without necessarily like using communications that, they may be tipped off by. Yeah. And it ultimately resulted in the landowners taking their land and being added to the jurisdiction of the neighboring county. So like the land was actually annexed to the next jurisdiction, just so law enforcement could not stop criminal activity on the premises.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And so again, things that you don't really think that you're going to stumble upon when you're going to talk to rural law enforcement.
But that really speaks to the dynamics of small town policing in the United States. And, Canada, for instance, has, like the United States, many different police forces, but I don't think on the level of devolvement of power that the US has, like where you really have local police. And Australia being here, it's so much different. I mean, the New South Wales Police is one of the largest police forces in the world, and it's just a state-based police organization, so in very rural spaces, it's the New South Wales Police. And so I wonder if that helps the the history of the New South Wales Police is not all that colorful or great. It's somewhat colorful on these issues as well. So I'm not saying that it entirely mitigates any sort of corruption, but I wonder what that role has to play, that because you speak to those aspects of local dynamics and relationships and maybe even intergenerational police families and things like that are really bound to the community. And so I don't know if corruption is even always the best word. It is corruption, obviously, when it comes to this stage, but like almost like such a commitment and such a deep level of attachment to these communities that you do police the law in a different way because of that. And it's fascinating at that local level to think about how that plays out at the individual level.
Yeah, definitely. Sometimes I think back to those law enforcement interviews and I'm just like, I don't know how they do it. Like, you literally have to go to your work every day, especially in those last two communities that I just said, and like know that your community members are actively working against you. Like you said earlier, like it's so important to know that you have trust in your community, and like your community members don't really trust you. If anything, like they're actually working against you.
Yeah, I've seen it a couple of different ways. Like I talked to some officers up here that definitely live outside the city center for obvious reasons. The city center, I wouldn't call it the city center. Definitely live outside the where the stores are for a reason. But whenever I meet them in town, for instance, like we'll be having a coffee and every person who walks by says hi or comes to them with a problem or talks to them or knows them.
Yeah.
So it's almost like they're over included in everyone's business. So yeah, some of the things I've experienced have not necessarily been inclusion, but almost just as difficult when it comes to pressure and having to be on the clock, I guess, 24/7 as the law enforcement officer, because everyone knows you and because you've grown up. Speaking to that I do know officers in more urban environments, not necessarily rural, that purposely live about 5 cities, or I guess in your case 5 counties over, and commute into work because they were so sick of seeing the people that they arrested the night before and being very uncomfortable when they were out with their daughter or their son or their family, and that dynamic there. And so they purposely move away. And I remember one describing it was like, oh, I just wouldn't go east of this area, because that's when I start running into people. So I always went west, if we had to do a family outing, if we had to go shopping, or I just found that so interesting, the way that the nature of policing often requires ones to make, significant changes in their personal lives because of the job that they do.
Yeah. And I think it would also be interesting, kind of like related to that, like as we're talking about just like services in rural communities. Like I think of, thankfully, when I was a sexual assault advocate, I, was in a bigger city, but even like you ran the risks of, being out and about, and like if someone who you had just, helped had like recognized you. Like I know many advocates who have like ran into survivors that they've helped before, and it's just like, okay, well, like how do you go ahead and like acknowledge you, but like also not go ahead and like try to like give anything away. And like I think that is kind of even like elevated to a whole different level when you do live in a rural community where you're very bound to run into them, compared to like living in an urban area where there's hundreds of thousands of people there.
Yeah, so everybody knows everybody, and there's almost a sort of self-enforced cone of silence, isn't there?
Yeah.
There's a moment of recognition, but okay, nobody's going to say anything because that was then, and now it's now.
And I know what you mean about the awkwardness too, because this is obviously nothing to do with sexual assault surviving, so that would be obviously much more accentuated. But I ran into the nurse who birthed my son the day after, and it was like, well, how do you broach this? I just spent 48 hours with him in a room, and like, are we friends now? Or no, I see them all the time and everywhere. Or I run into my doctor. Actually, he was there. I had the house next to me for sale, and I see him pull up and go look at the house. I'm like, oh, this is how do you broach? You're
like, you can't live here. Like, no, well, you got to live somewhere else.
It's a formal relationship we have. When does it become like a bit informal? And so I've learned to definitely be careful about relationships and friendships in a smaller town, because you will see those people all the time.
You're quite likely to bump into the Vice Chancellor on a Saturday afternoon at the supermarket.
Exactly. So
in a regional place. Yeah,
it's amazing. Well, Alistair, did you have any burning questions that you think we've left off around policing or any of those issues?
No, I don't think so. We've covered a bit of ground over the hour. That's good.
I think so. Danielle, did you have anything that you kind of wanted to add or something to talk about to close out?
I don't think so. I mean, I can give both of you, Alistair, if you didn't keep them, I can give you both access to or PDFs of the global methamphetamine article that I published, and then also the rural law enforcement article that I published. And I will say I wasn't quite sure where we were going to go in this interview. So last night I was like reading the latest World Drug Report from the United Nations, and I was like,
no, but that's
I was like,
is
this still? I was like, is this still going on? And I was really interested to see that, you know, kind of the things that we had talked about in both of those articles, you know, we're still going on today. And so I think that, you know, it's kind of, for me, taking up this idea of drug research, I've really seen, again, like how I talked about, everyone back home in Oklahoma seems to be touched by, you know, drug abuse, whether it's, you know, someone directly or, you know, someone indirectly. Like the foster children that my family took in as a foster family, every single one of them had a parent that had been using drugs, and that's why they were in the foster care system. And so I think what makes me more willing to take up this cause, and why I wish that there were more focus on it, is especially looking at it globally and seeing how now we are seeing organized crime networks tied to it. Like that means that there's an increase in violence associated with it. And that's what makes me nervous, is, you know, to see how that little boy can be like, I'm going to go ahead and take a life because like I have to take a life. Like we may not see that violence to that degree, you know, in Australia or in America, especially in rural areas. But I think that if it continues, you know, the way that it's going, it's not impossible to think that we may not see it in some degree or some variation, even in rural communities. And so that's kind of why I'm passionate about it. Yeah.
And even on top of the violence, there's also just simply the deaths, you know, when those support systems aren't in place, when those healthcare systems are absent from rural spaces. I mean, look at the literature on opioid overdose. More people die in rural spaces than urban spaces, and the reasons why are very obvious. And so death and violence definitely follows in the wake if it's not addressed appropriately.
We've considered this from rural in a US context, but of course, and I'm reflecting back on that foreign correspondent video, there's the rural over in Mexico too. Long winding dirt roads with, by necessity, a whole heap of security measures put in place. And I think they're flying drones over to make sure that law enforcement aren't coming, to have the bribe ready for when they do. And just reflecting on that you know, I highly encourage people to look at it, this little story. And the 13-year-old who's desperately keen to become a vet, but it's got this air of recognition that I'm just going to become a drug manufacturer, and I'm just going to have to kill people.
Life is predetermined. Where is the story? Where can listeners find it?
We'll put up a link. It's
I'll put it up on the YouTube.
The ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, and it's a foreign correspondent article item.
And Danielle, if you send through the links of those papers, I can attach them to the YouTube so people can click on the links of your papers and follow them through.
Perfect.
I guess I just have one last question, if we can touch on one more thing that I've been curious about, going back to the beginning on these redemption stories. What's your hypothesis, kind of like, what's their role, do you think? What are you looking for in that regard?
So I hypothesize, if I had to, you know, go ahead and make one. I'm thinking that when, and this kind of like seems kind of like a duh thing. I guess that wasn't really like academic, like duh. But I'm thinking that when people do believe that others are redeemable, that's when you're going to see more services for them, more treatment for them, more belief in rehabilitation for them. And not only for them, but for others in your community. Like, I think that, and why I'm interested in that is, you know, when we do have states or federal governments that they may not be getting as much money back into those communities, what can those communities do on a grassroots level to still go ahead and promote betterness in their communities, not only for those individuals that might need them, but for the generations to come? Because we do know that drugs are not just a victimless crime. It affects everyone. And you know, just because you may not see it necessarily helping one person, or that person may go ahead and relapse, like that doesn't mean that it's not helping 10 other people by having a needle exchange in that community. And so I guess that's kind of what I'm believing that I'm going to see, is when you do find communities and individuals that do hold that redemption belief, that there will be, you know, a support system for that individual, whether that be at the community level or their friends and their family.
I wonder about the role of redemption stories in public health messaging in terms of engendering and growing political support for public health strategies towards drug use. You see it in the punitiveness literature again, that when people are provided with context, you know, instead of saying Johnny, you know, murdered a person, you say, you know, Johnny grew up in this environment, Johnny was abused, Johnny had this is what happened, what do you think we should do with Johnny? The response changes dramatically, because you have the context to allow yourself, I think, to allow for and open up to concepts of redemption. So that's really interesting.
Well, thank you both for having me. And, you know, I'm pleased to be here.
Thanks for coming. Like I said, it's best to wing these conversations often, because they go in such fascinating, interesting directions. And I mean, the ground we've covered in an hour is absolutely, you know, really interesting. This has been a really great conversation. Thank you for taking the time at 7 p.m. Our Wednesday, I think it is. Our Wednesday is just starting and your Tuesday is just ending. So thank you very much. Appreciate it. And we will get you the recording. This will be up on YouTube in the video format, but also Spotify and Apple. So thanks again. Really appreciate it.